Hi, what's on my mind this week is the role of the public intellectual. Who is a public intellectual? What are the responsibilities of a public intellectual? How do we engage with our public intellectuals? At times such as this, where there's just so much going on, whether it's the escalating attacks in Iran, constant stream of corruption-related cases in Nigeria, the Afrophobia attacks in South Africa, and the list goes on and on. I find myself reaching for my phone or even type what has been said, who is saying something. I can already imagine some of what Ekene's responses will be, but join us as Ekene and I discuss the role of the public intellectual in society.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this new episode of What's on Your Mind with Ekene and Ayisha. You're welcome. And today we have a special guest, Professor Matthias Chika Modi. He's an expert on economics and banking, Chief Executive Officer of the National Competitiveness Council of Nigeria, and Chairman of United Capital, formerly UBA Capital. He's highly experienced and accomplished emerging markets executive in finance, business development, investments, and public policy. He's an honorable senior member of the Chartered Institute of Bankers of Nigeria, an adjunct professor, SAIS Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C. You're welcome, Chika. Thank you for joining us again, because I know you've been a guest on our show, so it's a pleasure to have you back with us today.
Thank you, Ayisha.
Ekene, how are you? How's your week been so far?
Yeah, we're learning to swim against the tide. So I guess we're becoming fit as a result. So yeah, it's been a productive week, just a little stressful.
Fantastic. It's funny, I was counting how many times I said intellectual. I've gotten a penny for each time. So to be honest, as I said in the promo, there are several reasons why I've been thinking about this question. And I think I would like to think of it in two ways. The first is what I said in the promo, that there's just so much going on in the world. And I just can't help wondering, and I'm hoping that there are other people who have been wondering as well, that what are our thinkers and intellectuals saying about this issue or that issue, whatever issue it is that they care about. You know, it just seems to be never ending, from the scandal regarding the alleged fake presidential foreign intervention promotion council that got over ₦1 billion in the Nigerian budget. I mean, for me, I find that so embarrassing to think that, you know, foreign dignitaries, diplomats have been meeting with this character, and then suddenly the state feels no shame in saying that this person is, you know, has been a fraudster all along. It's just hard to believe. And then you move from that to the fact that there's 34 trillion supposedly that never made it to the FG account but has been spent. So one reason why I'm wondering where intellectuals are is because of this steady stream of just things that are alarming, that have long-term repercussions, that you just feel as if are just going to be swept under the carpet over. It's just like everything else is. And then on the second hand, there was an interesting phrase that came up a couple of weeks ago called the Olodo Uprising. And it went viral in, you know, obviously in Nigeria, people were talking about it. And it's a phrase that I think, as far as I know, we first heard from YC, musician, celebrity, when he was on the Afropolitan podcast, The Hidden Truth About Streaming Money, which was published June 24th, 2026. And I was taken by it, just as many people were, because I do think side by side with the question where are intellectuals is admitting that there's a dumbing down of public discourse in Nigeria. There's a denigration of thinking, of questioning and debate, you know, which in a way is almost ironic considering how much we seem to love qualifications. But then that's when I realized that, yeah, we do love qualifications. We like, because we're sort of status driven people. So we like the qualifications, but we do not really like learning. We do not like being corrected. We don't want to self-correct. We don't want other people to correct us. We don't want to correct other people. And, you know, so we want the certificates, but we don't want to earn them. And there is definitely, as YC was saying, an elevation of the Olodos in a way, you know. So these days, it's like, oh, you know, you talk too much English, you know, talk is cheap. Just different ways, a myriad of ways to just sort of denigrate people who want to have a conversation, who want to debate things. Instead, it's just, oh, show money, show power. This is all that matters. But I know that this is not everybody. I know that at least there's some intellectuals that are still trying, so, you know, persevering. And I'm wondering, you know, do we recognize them? Do we know them? Do we appreciate them? Do we respect them? That it must be a really lonely road to be an intellectual or to be even any kind of person in a society who's constantly trying to draw people's attention, to make them aware of things that are going on that will have severe repercussions in the present and in the future. I mean, so many WhatsApp groups where people with, titles of professor and doctor and all whatnot in front of their names, some of them are even recognizable names from when I was younger, who've maintained columns, written books, but they've all turned apologists for the government, one government or the other. If it's not a state government, it's a federal government. If it's not one party, it's another party with some ethno-nationalist agenda. So again, when you see the compromise of intellectuals goes again side by side with why increasingly society doesn't seem to care about, integrity, intellectual rigor, or thinking. And when you even look at what we tend to applaud, the kinds of prizes that go to things like reality TV, as opposed to the kinds of prizes that go to, anything to do with academic smarts or writing or thinking. So it's been bothering me. And as I said, Ekene, I teased that I'm sure I have a sense of where you would come. I can hear you already saying, yeah, but Ayisha, you're talking about ourselves. I think that's it for me. It's just something to talk about, and curious to hear your thoughts and Chika's thoughts as well.
Okay. I was amused because I actually didn't know my thoughts in a sense until I opened my mouth. So when you said it, I'm like, I wonder what my thoughts are, because I wanted to hear from you. I wanted to hear, the angle you were coming at it from. So a few things came to mind when I was listening to you. And one of it was, which came first? This appetite for the public intellectual. A lot of times people assume it's not there. I did a recent interview with Chidiodd Kalu. And initially when I listened back to it, I thought, would this really capture anyone's imagination? Because I enjoyed it because he was going through his own thoughts, his own philosophies around, nationhood, identity, Pan-Africanism. And I found it very engaging. And, I find such conversations very engaging. When I've had the opportunity to interview, and I'm not trying to blow any trumpet, these are the kind of things I find intriguing. And then you say, do people have any interest in such? But actually, when you look at the feedback, yes, there is an appetite. People really do want, because I left the interview feeling a sense of hope, because he was able to pull back. And this is where I think your topic feeds into mine. He was able to pull back from the narrow, way we see things, where we're dealing with the scraps, where we're scrambling around in the dust. Meanwhile, you need to pull back to see the vision to be able to then tackle the things. You need to realize that you're the one that has the pen in your hand to rewrite the vision in the first place. So, one of the things that came up in my mind when you and I were talking or conversing was, what are some of the characteristics of the intellectual? It's not so much even the academia or the fact that you're privileged enough to have had a certain level of education. I would say it's the privilege of being able to stop and think and come up with innovative ideas and be sincere and unbiased in the way you approach solution, problem solving. I was watching yesterday Einstein. It was a documentary on Netflix about Einstein and just the way he approached in the midst of what Hitler was doing in Germany and how he had to flee to England and his own outlook. I thought it was well done. He was coming at it from an investigative, a very curious, exploratory, and there has to be that childlike, putting away your biases as much as you can to want to discover something new for the greater good. And that's what I say is the challenge of the public intellectual. And yes, I say there is an appetite, in spite of the Olodo Uprising, in spite of this veneer that we're all only interested in distraction and entertainment. Actually, when you put together a conversation like what's on your mind and you put it in the midst of the public discourse, you'll find that, and it's not just for the elite. That's what I'm trying to say. Anybody will be able to follow your train of thought and find it intriguing, because suddenly it holds out that rod of hope that we can actually reinvent ourselves. We don't have to remain where we find ourselves. We can find a solution beyond the parameters we've been told confine us, because we have the mind, we have the will, we have the imagination. That's what it speaks to. And we have the sincerity to say, look, and just to round off with this, when I spoke to Chidiodd Kalu, one of the things that came across to me was he was able to, I hope I'm not giving him too much credit, pull back from some of the usual divide or definitions of identity, tribe, and see the bigger picture and point us to some of the workings of, vulgar politics that want us to remain at the level of tribe and religion, which goes back to my own topic. So that gave me hope. Suddenly said, somebody's, I get that feeling when I listen to Dele Farotimi at times. Yes, he can be very philosophical, but he's pulling back. So we need more of those people who take us away from the rough and tumble, the vulgar politics, and say, look, actually, there's something bigger and we can rediscover it together. And we can recreate a country where all of us have a stake. And all of us have, that for me is the role of the public intellectual. I just want to stop there. Thanks.
Well, Ekene, hope is something that is really needed. As think, is in short supply. So some cynical people might say hope is something that's always been used. I mean, Karl Marx famously said that hope is the opium of the poor. So when they have hope, then a governing class could take advantage of that and use that to sustain them while they continue to oppress them. But there's a lot that is said there. Ayisha, when you talk about the dumbing down of the public discourse in Nigeria, I like that expression, Olodo.
Uprising, yeah.
Media, right? People who I think it goes beyond Nigeria. You're seeing it's almost a global phenomenon today. And I think for probably two main reasons. One reason is obviously there's been a transformation in how people communicate. There's been with social media and the internet and everything else. There's this diffusion of platforms where you used to have far more unified international setup. You had more unified platforms. People listened to a common source of news. There tended to be a common truth, and people did not have the ability to self-select. And therefore, it meant that the public discourse was sort of richer. Today, it's far more diffuse. People could self-select who they listen to. And if you look at social media and the various platforms of communications, the people with the largest followers are influencers and entertainers. And even in the political space, and the people who have the most followers and who are quote unquote authorities. And I'm not trying to deride them, but people like Very Dark and Mama Pace have more followers and more people listening to them than people who are probably experts in those areas. And there are many reasons, a variety of reasons for that. But it speaks to the changing role of the public intellectual because the environment has changed. It's not the traditional environment it used to be. So public intellectuals, I would like to think people who are in academia or epistemology and are stepping out of that space to a public space and trying to curate or simplify complex academic notions so that the public can understand that. So that's bridging that gap between what is abstract or theoretical and what is reality. So they came at this way traditionally with a lot of authority. That has changed. There's been a war on the truth. There's been a war on facts. There's a war on credible institutions. There's a war on logic, and there's a war on science in many societies. And it's classic from a dictator's playbook. If you go back to the first half of the last century, it was something similar. So if you discredit the media as the press, journalist status, you discredit academia, you discredit all the experts, then fascism can thrive. You can provide you an alternative truths to them. And so I just made that point that is not unique to Nigeria. It doesn't make it any less difficult, or some would say even painful, but it's just it's a normal phenomena. And so
I'm curious. Sorry for interrupting. So would you say that we're in a fascist state in Nigeria? I hear you that it's not Nigeria only. There's a trend globally, and of course, social media and its algorithms play a big role in that. And would you say we talk about the US, we talk about many parts of Europe? Well, would you call Nigeria a fascist state?
I wouldn't go as far as characterizing Nigeria as a fascist state. It's a democracy, and I'll tell you why. It's a democracy, albeit illiberal. In a true fascist state, they tend to dispense completely with elections and multi-party elections and people having a say in who they pick, and there's just a veneer of that. They had elections in Nazi Germany. At some point, it just became you heard this guy last week, this Sandinista guy, Ortega in Nicaragua, and he's saying that there'll be no more elections, right? So true fascism at that point, the state now has full control. So even Viktor Orban at his peak had not succeeded in making Hungary a fascist state, and that's why he could get elected out of office. So Nigeria is showing tendencies of an illiberal democracy, but it's definitely not fascist. But what tends to happen with aspiring dictators, they tend to sort of walk off the same playbook. And part of that is to, discredit institutions. Part of that is to take control of information and what can serve as the truth. And they create massive deterrents for public intellectuals and people who want to speak the truth. So deterrents in the sense that there could be severe sanctions against them and their loved ones if they're speaking the truth in a public place. And then those who are silent, they incentivize them for their silence, or even worse still, for endorsing or, interpreting what they're doing as they changing the definition of the truth for one that suits the government. So some of it is just natural human behavior, but there would always be those that are in that space that speak out. The challenge now is how, you have to move from this being the sage on the stage where you had all the authority and you could speak and there's a unified platform to this point where you are more of a mediator and you're trying to get as many people to get to a point of view in a very, very disparate social media propagation space.
Oh, thanks. Well, I mean, I didn't mean to. Yeah, do you want to come in, Ekene?
Yeah, just a number of things I made a note of. I mean, he mentioned hope as the opium of the masses. I think, on the contrary, I think hope is something we can't do without. I don't think it's this wishy-washy, dumbing sort of something you just almost like putting a dummy in the mouth of a child and not giving them any true substantial. I think hope for me is like the vision that you set out in front of people that makes them want to move forward. So I'm not looking at hope as this sort of wishy-washy thing. I'm looking at something that moves people to actually take action. The other thing he mentioned, which I agree with, is the war on truth. That has definitely affected the whole idea of public, because like I was saying when you and I had some exchange that, one of the characteristics of intellectual application is that you're actually seeking the truth. And this is where I want to land at the third point I noted. The thing about public, somehow aligning public intellectualism with expertise. I know it may seem like I'm contradicting myself, but I don't necessarily think that one and the same. You can have expertise, but not be genuine in your seeking of the truth. So all your knowledge still points us to a dead end. So I wouldn't necessarily say that expertise is that. It doesn't necessarily, for me, recommend itself to me as a mark of a public intellectual. You have the tools, but it's how you exercise your mind, because intellectualism is really the exercise of intellect. It doesn't really have to do with the vault of knowledge you possess. Mm-hmm. And yes, it helps, but if you're not actually wired to seek the truth, to explore, to investigate sincerely, then we could do without all the knowledge you have. It will only just lead us to a dead end. So that's really, I wanted to point out that. So where you have people exercising their intellect, where you have people, and I know it might seem like I'm throwing it too far, but I feel that some of the things that engender that is to create places where people can sit down and reflect, where they're not so bogged down in the everyday hustle parks, so they can see value in life and begin to think and create and come up with solutions and innovate. So
but that's something we don't have.
It will come from the masses. It won't come from just a few people, without integrity. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
But we don't
Ayisha.
have public spaces. No, I was just saying that it's funny. I mean, I actually wrote a piece in Substack. I published over the weekend, because again, on this Olodo Uprising, it made me think that you're right. When you say we need the time and the space, social media doesn't quite cut it anymore. Whether it's once upon a time, Twitter, now known as X, used to be a place where you would like to think, people with ideas are there exchanging, but it's become a cesspool. I no longer belong there. Instagram is, it's really about, and TikTok seem to be about videos. So when you think about television and radio, again, it's not exactly free. You have to be invited by the anchors. The anchors have their own agenda. They're also scared about losing their licenses. So when I think about Nigeria, and maybe even not just Nigeria, at least in different parts of the world, people can come out and protest and it's fairly safe. In Nigeria, come out to protest and the likelihood of being shot at, tear gassed, being harassed by thugs. So where are the public places where Nigerians can actually come together and talk? Is it the churches and the mosques? Again, I would sort of put the churches and the mosques as part of the establishment, not too dissimilar from the radio stations and the TV stations. They too are aligned with the status quo and not really providing that haven for people to just talk, just as Ekene said, how do you even pick yourselves up? How do you imagine? How do you create?
Or even challenge an atmosphere where you can challenge authority.
But where are those spaces? I'm curious. Where are those spaces?
Yeah, they used to be at the universities, right?
It's no longer universities. I actually pointed that out in my article. When in 2019, I was going around different universities with my book, Love Doesn't Win Elections, and I was shocked how we were at Foot Owerri. I will never forget. And SSS came out and said, what is going on here? And I was just like, why are you here? Like, students are talking. Why are you here? But just to show you, so to be honest, I actually push against your characterization of Nigeria as not a fascist state. I think just the way the world is evolving, fascism has not stayed still. Fascism has also evolved and has different faces. People like Tinubu and Buhari are wise enough to know that, if the West would leave us alone because we pretend to have elections, then we pretend to have elections. But if we've sewn everything up from INEC to the political parties' registration and the courts, how is this an election if it's a non-election? So you can't complain, you can't protest. People are impoverished. I do think we're in a fascist state in Nigeria.
Well, if I may, I think, Ekene, you talked about hope. And when you said hope, I actually think it's a good thing. And I said that maybe I was misunderstood, but I now extended it and I quoted Karl Marx, not that I necessarily subscribe to that in the context that we're talking about. So hope is a very necessary.
Sorry, can I come? Is it hope that was the opium or is it religion that is the opium of the masses? I thought it was religion.
Well, religion, hope, they're translations of that. A sense
of the future.
But it's all exactly, it's all tied to the fact that you have the expectation of glorious, it's like a terrorist who chooses to go to, like, I hate to use that example, but, if you have a terrorist who believes that if he blows himself up, he's going to go to some sort of paradise, that typically he is anyway. So that is a hope in some future that is detached from today, so you could justify today continuing, right? But the issue of expertise, I think the media environment has really changed, right? So today it rewards a lot of brevity, something sensational, something that has emotional, resonance, as against a rigorous, logical argument.
I'm saying ouch because I'm in the media.
No, it's not just you. It's just by definition, Twitter, Instagram, 24/7 news. It just sort of like, it doesn't lend itself to deep analysis. And so when the public intellectuals navigating these spaces, she or he or they have to sort of like, think about, okay, who's the audience? This audience is now so fragmented. You got to have something that is immediate, easy to digest, and then use that to convey that. And therein lies the real skill or difficulty, if you like, right? I'll give you an example. Some months ago, I featured on some terrestrial stations, and they were talking about the Iran war and where it would go. And I gave my opinions on how long I thought it would last and how it would be. Now, some of those notions could look somewhat complex, right? If you have a simple diagram and you have a presentation that is clear, maybe color-coded, it makes it easier for people to understand that. But if you want to go through explaining some of the things that have actually happened now and that continue to happen, then you lose your audience. So you have to deal with that part. Now, if I circle back to the idea of Nigeria as a fascist state, and I'm not holding brief for the government, without a shadow of a doubt, there's been a lot of regression when it comes to human rights and the democracy in the last few years in Nigeria, without a shadow of a doubt. But at the same time, when you're thinking of fascism, even if fascism is mutating, and I understand, actually, I get your point, and obviously fascism in 2026 would not be what it was in the 30s, right? So it will mutate. But they still have some very common characteristics, right? And I think when you get there, it will be pretty clear that you're getting there, right? So today you could be a religious leader, you could go and rail against the government. In media, I watch on TV every other day, there are people who are criticizing the president and the party and the rest of it. And they're working and they're living to tell the story. Right. It gets to a point where even the TV station or radio station or whatever would not be able to, they would have to cut off, they would not be able to carry such things. It gets to a point where they're actually owned by the state or interests that are friendly with the state. Right. So here in the US, we're seeing how media ownership is changing. We're seeing how institutions are being challenged, right? And so it's sort of like if you're going down, it might sound a bit nuanced, but the idea is that you're going down a path and you could say, here's where we are. And I think, quite frankly, the Nigerian state in many ways is actually weak. You can see that in how the challenges around kidnapping and security are going on and other challenges. So a true fascist state doesn't have that kind of weakness because they definitely would have the monopoly of violence within the territory that they control.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, thank you for
that. I wanted to go down the road of what you predicted I will say, which is where do we come in? I think we have to land it somewhere. We can't leave it for other people. We can't outsource it. And I think for me, one of the examples that came to mind is you may not necessarily have the platform some public intellectuals have, like, I don't know, Chimamanda or even Wole Soyinka, etc. But I find that, just to use a very basic illustration, when you have oversight over people, especially young people, watch how they respond to your version of leadership in Nigeria. I give you two illustrations. If you're the kind that likes people to dobale for you and say, yes, ma, They will read the room very quickly and they'll give you exactly the yes ma'am kind of. They'll basically suppress their thought process and just give you what you want because they're very accustomed to lots of leadership styles that just want that obeisance. But the minute you switch and you start challenging them, and I'm saying this from experience, and you start challenging them to think for themselves, and you start rewarding that process, and you start, allowing them to reason with you, you'll be surprised the transformation. The same person saying yes ma'am to you will give you some very deep analysis, and then you'll find out that person is doing several things behind the scenes that shows how capable they are. They're running, a mini business somewhere. They have a brand here. So it just depends what you are rewarding in your place of influence. These people haven't suddenly become zombies. They have thoughts, but you have to reward it. You have to draw it out. Otherwise, they know well how to play the game. They know, I say, which side your bread is buttered. So that's what I would say in terms of where we can come in. It's not so much what we say, is how we also encourage people to be thinking human beings, how we reward that thinking in other people whom we interact with on a daily.
All right. Well, sorry, because I'm the one managing, we will be on this topic for another. We could easily complete the 4 hour on this topic, but I think it's time to introduce Ekene's topic right now. And the reason why is I actually see that we'll probably dovetail at the end when we go back to talking about solutions. So there'll be a chance for you, Chika, if you can hold that thought to share what you wanted to share at the end of Ekene's provocation.
What's on my mind is how to take the hate. How to take the hate out of politics, out of elections. It's strange how the whole power struggle, the whole dialogue around nation building has become so toxic and venomous, from the Trump era to even the Tinubu era. And just across the world, it seems, Nigel Farage, people seem to be bent on the us versus them narrative. How do we break out of that? How do we break out of that and choose to see the things that bind us together? After all, when the dust settles, we're all in it together, aren't we? That's what's on my mind, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And of course, unpacking this with Ayisha.
The definition of public intellectualism, you actually said, applying your intellect devoid or apart from emotion. And this, what I'm dealing with, what I'm focused on, a lot of emotion. It has seeped into the way we do politics, the way we engage in nation building. It's emotion being whipped up. It's emotion being influenced and stoked up and baited. And it's all this binary, almost very, I was going to say primitive kind of instinct being provoked. And you look at the whole thing and you're like, it's very discouraging, very disheartening, because we're better than that. And at the end of the day, it's almost like you're cutting your nose to spite your face. If you burn your house down, you'll be the one outside with no house. So I don't understand what's going on here. We've all lost our minds and we're just being played on another level. Even the leaders who think they're getting away with something, they're very short-sighted. I don't want to start using terms of insult. So I thought, let me pull back from the emotion and just try and pull out some data that actually says what we all already know. And it says the data demonstrates that politics has become increasingly partisan. And one of the illustrations it uses is from the Pew Research Center. It says the number of moderate Democrats, and that's in your area, Chika, and Republicans in Congress has plummeted to roughly 24, down from over 160 in the early 1970s. As both parties move further from the ideological center. Then they talk about a deepening animosity, the fact that polling shows that the proportion of partisans holding very unfavorable views of the opposing party has doubled, and it's reaching record highs. Furthermore, it says a Royal Society Open Science study found that divisions among the public on social and political issues have increased by 64% since 1988. And then it talks of something it terms affective polarization. Studies utilizing feeling thermometers reveal that voters increasingly associate negative emotions, anger, fear, with opposing political faction. And this is a trend observed across the US and various European democracies. And so, basically, what we feel is happening, what we see on the news is actually happening. I don't know, Chika, you want to throw, because I also want you to, in the time you have, how do we break, let's not leave it on diagnosing the problem. How do we break away from this?
Well, look, your commentary is spot on. It's hard to debate this, and it's happening not just in the US. It's happening in the UK, where you are, and it's happening in Nigeria as well. And I think 3 factors have driven this. Let me just very quickly talk on that. And they're sort of structural. The first we spoke already about, that's the media, the way the media landscape has changed and the way people consume information has changed a lot. In the case of the US, they have this thing they call gerrymandering, right, where districts are drawn by the party in power in the state. And they've been drawing those districts to make them more partisan, so they could guarantee they win them. And when you have that happen, then the politicians' incentive, what really matters to them is to win the primaries, not to win the general elections. So the part of why you don't have many competitive seats now, you have some like 20 plus, right? 22. It's really because of gerrymandering. If they withdraw those district lines, they'll be far more competitive, and it will be beneficial for the politics because they would have to attract the votes of moderates and people who are not in their party. The third thing is identity politics, which probably, hopefully, is maybe what might be the denouement, right? So they've used identity politics to divide people, and politics has become adversarial. The kind of language that is used to describe your opponent or the opposing party is militant language, is martial language, like warlike, and it makes them almost an existential threat. So it's no surprise that you have that happening. And then because people self-select the media that they watch and they consume, it further calcifies that state. And it's if you go to Nigeria, again, it's like I said, it's happening in all three countries. It's not dissimilar. They've weaponized religion in parts of the country where in the past it wasn't. Yes, there were religious differences, but it wasn't the definition of politics. And even in the moderate Southwest, people have managed to bring in clerics and everything else, and that further divides the country now and makes the politics very adversarial and toxic, right? If you think something's existential, you react to it differently. The person becomes your enemy, as against someone who has a different view on how you can solve the same solutions, which is what politics is meant to be. Both parties should be thinking about in this country and in Nigeria. All the opposition and the government should be working on how do we make life better for Nigerians? How do we solve our common problems? And they compete on ideas and who can solve it better, as against don't vote for demonizing your opponent and pointing out why you should never vote for them. Now, you talked about solutions. That is pretty complex. I mean, I wish there was a single silver bullet or magic wand you could use and therefore say, hey, this is how it can be solved. Because the reason why I try to explain the causes is so that you can see that solutions would have to address those causes. How do we get people to go back to having a common truth, having a common set of facts? How do we get them to go back to agreeing that, hey, if a scientist says this because they're measuring it and they have these things and whatever, it's more credible than a demagogue who is just trying to whip up emotion and turn us against our fellow citizen, right? So I'll give you an example. I think literacy is a big factor. It's not a solution, but it's a big factor. If you look at literacy levels in Nigeria and even in the US, and you compare the partisanship to the literacy level, you're going to see what is like a bimodal distribution, right? Bimodal means that you have like two peaks. So at one peak will be where people are sort of illiterate, less literate, they don't quite understand issues, therefore they're being manipulated, and you have them there. And the other peak is where people are quite literate, but perhaps are so frustrated with the system and how it's working that they are radically opposed to it as well, right? But drawing a lot of the people at the bottom of the literacy line, if you like, then you kind of make it easier to have more sensible conversations and make them less gullible, as it were. So I would say literacy is part of that. Now, literacy, not just in terms of, it's important that people can read and write. We have bad literacy levels in many segments of Nigeria. So like in Northwest and in others, less than 1 out of 4 females can actually read and write. Right. And if you now
Sorry, bear with me, Chika, because I know you may leave. I want to just comment on that. The literacy and what you've described as the two peaks of literacy and how people exhibit this gullibility or even aggression in politics. But some would ask, because part of why I'm disheartened is not if you say, the people at the grassroots who don't know any better, is I'm actually encountering people like me who are exposed, who are knowledgeable, and there are people in the House, the Senate, and the Republic, the parties in America. They are also struggling they are also the ones, because they're the ones letting the Trumps get away with it. The so-called intellectuals, the so-called exposed. So it's not happening among the people who are illiterate. It's happening among people who are literate and intentional about what they're doing. I don't know. Do you get what I'm saying?
I agree. I agree. And the second thing I was going to say about literacy, when I started saying it's not just literacy, but it's actually what people learn. So the political class, the political actors, the political class, they're acting to incentives and disincentives. They're rational actors. So you notice that at the beginning of the Trump era, there are people who were critical of him and that sort of politics. And then the vast majority of them jumped on board, right? The same thing in Nigeria. You have people who had certain views about certain things when you had a certain government and they saw, hey, this was working, they jumped on board. So they will react to incentives and disincentives. This is normal for political class, right? But they do that, they're following where the electorate is going. If the electorate is going this way, at least in the US, in the UK, then the politicians react to that. If they feel that I would be buried in a primary, there's no way I can emerge if I go against this person, then they wouldn't go against them. But if the electorate is responding in a logical way, in a way that protects their core interests, then the political class would again react to that. And that's why I say it's not just literacy, but it's what you actually teach people. I mean, they're flooding the zone with a lot of nonsense that is very easy to debunk. If people have a fundamental exposure to information, right? Then those things can be, we don't have time. I could give you examples, but there's some of the things that are brought forward and people are listening to it and they're allowing it, and people actually, some believe it. The majority might not, but the substantial enough minority believe it. And they can make a difference in terms of the electoral dynamics. And therefore, you have now come that is pernicious, right, for the society. Because, if you're denying elections or you're denying, a system, a legal system, or you're challenging the validity of the judiciary and things of that nature, it has very bad outcomes. Right.
Yes.
And so this is where I'm going. So to round up, I think long term, just going beyond today's game, is that it's good to educate people. It's good for them to have access to real information. I mean, Buhari would never have come back to Nigeria if the generation that was old enough to vote then and were aware of these things and were informed of the things that were going on in 1983, 84, 85, they would not have the mates that were created around him brought him back. And he was empowered to go back to the same status views that just essentially took the country back to the same, I don't want to be overly critical of him, but the fact is that he brought a status view that was similar to the same things that happened in 84, 85. And the myth and legend of how times were good back then meant that he could do that. And it had disastrous consequences for the country, right? For the economy, for a lot of things as well. So not just being literate, but it's also what we learn. And public intellectuals try to navigate this space to become mediators so they could get more and more people in this fragmented media space to come on board with logic and some of it, quite frankly, common sense.
Okay. Thanks so much. I know you're about to rush off, so I'm glad you were able to chip in your thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much.
Second half.
Thank you too, Anne.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So Ayisha, I guess you can now hop in because I'm left with this question. Clearly, being literate or being educated, it doesn't quite cut it. Unless we're going to now dissect what does being educated mean. Because as far as I'm concerned, the worst part of the scenario we find ourselves in is when you find so-called intelligent, exposed people spitting out this kind of bile. I find it so disheartening. But over to you.
Yeah, no, I think you made a good point, and it was interesting listening to you and Chika. A couple of things. Yeah, definitely right. It's not lack of education or awareness. It's almost like something's shifted in the world. I know my favorite boogeyman or masquerade is, capitalism. Yeah, because we're now the way the world is very individualistic. Is you, yourself, and yourself, and everybody's a brand and everybody needs to look after themselves. So there's been a selfishness over decades that's been baked in. So yeah, and the incentives, which is what Chika was speaking to, if the incentives of society are such that, what matters is what you have, whether it's the the trappings of, conspicuous consumerism or greed, then they are made, nobody's really looking at your values. I mean, look, if you look at here, look at Nigel Farage. He went to public school. He's well educated, right? I mean, in fact, sounds like he's very well off. He has houses in almost multiple countries and cities. So you'd like to think what's driving you, but there's now a sense also that, this is the kind of rhetoric. So what you call toxic, whether it's people, speaking to identity issues that are meant to polarize, scare. It's always easier, and I think we've talked about this before, to use fear to whip people up than to use, oddly enough, hope, which we talked about in the first half of this conversation. But yeah, it's easier to sell hatred, fear, than to sell hope, love, a vision of peace and comfort. I've been in so many conversations lately where I'm just like, the world doesn't have to be the way it is. We designed this. This is man-made. We can have it. We can have an alternative to what we have right now. If we want a world where everybody has enough, but nobody has trillions, we can design that world as well. And it's actually an okay world. We've just been, so I would say, yeah, sadly enough, it's tied, as I said, I thought it would be tied to the first conversation, because if we say we want the antidote to toxic speech, rhetoric, toxic politics is to have more conversations, more in-depth conversations, more debates, not to silence people, but to say, okay, bring your views. You think this, you think X, let's debate it to the conclusion. One of my favorite scenes of, what used to be my favorite TV show, West Wing, was one where there was this guy who was running for office, and I think he had this sort of scandal hanging over his head. And he said, today, I'm answering every and any question. There were hundreds of people. By the time the scene was over, he was the only person standing. He was like, I will answer every, and that's the way to kill a scandal. Just confront it. Don't hide anything. Just speak. Don't run away. Don't hide, duck into cars. So it's the same thing. We need to have these conversations, all the different sides, not filled with hate, obviously. That's too easy, but in a manner that allows people. But then I guess they must also be ready to have their views challenged and questioned. I'm not sure that we still live in that kind of world, but there's no harm in trying. I think the kind of work that we are doing with this podcast and other people are doing, it's just that, again, back to how do we build power together? Because again, it's okay, me and you talking here with a handful of listeners, other people are talking there with a handful. How do we support each other? I think, which comes to my own thinking about intellectuals and where they are. It's lonely to be the only one sort of speaking into the space, and you're not even sure if anybody is paying attention. But if there was a coalition of people who are supporting each other, encouraging each other, feeding into each other's, intellectualism and our desire to sort of have better societies built from the bottom up, then I think, as they say, misery loves company. So since we're miserable with the status quo, where is the company? We need the company.
Let's band together. Yes. No, thank you for that. I think, because when Chika mentioned, whatever wins elections, he said, is where the tide of political elite will flock.
Yeah.
And then I said, maybe we need to understand this word winning elections. Winning for what? A lot of people just holding on to power for power. So what have you won?
Yeah.
Because if at the end of the day we're worse off because you're in power, nobody has won. We haven't won. You haven't won. You're not interested in serving us. You're just interested in serving your own, desire to have power, which is just crazy. But one of the other things, apart from what you said, which I agree, more conversations. And for me, every conversation that is vital is even if you're talking to a small audience, if you seed hope in that person will take it and run with it. And we don't know how far it will go. But the other aspect is something, again, that Chidi Odinkalu mentioned, which is he was talking about history. I'm talking about how we need to teach history more. I know we've talked about, this sort of thing here on What's on Your Mind. And when he finished, my husband, when he watched interview, said that's the aspect of interview he didn't feel quite did justice to the whole, interrogation. If you just to see the idea that we should teach history. And what are you going to do about that? Are you going to create some sort of vault of history, like a Wikipedia for Nigerian or African history so that people can go in there and be enlightened? So is that taking the idea from the intellectual phase to a more practical, accessible phase? Because definitely I agree. The more we discover ourselves, because he feels that a lot of the twistedness of Nigeria is back to the post-colonial, just immediately after colonialism, and how we have a lot of our history has been used to weaponized in a way and told to us in a way that keeps us from understanding the ties that actually bind us, our shared identity. So if you go back and rediscover all those things, then you will have a sense of a bond that goes beyond money, that goes beyond because I do somehow hanker after a time, my great grandparents where there was dignity. I know we've talked about these things where everything didn't boil down to how much money you earned. Your name meant something. People knew who your parents were.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there was still a strong tie to identity then than we have now, where materialism seems to be, everyone feels that that's enough to feel themselves. So history, but how do we make that history accessible to the average person? So
that's the role of the intellectual. One of the roles of the intellectual is to break down complex knowledge into bite-sized pieces for people. I mean, again, it's happening slowly. I mean, if I can give kudos to the Republic, it's a journal. They have this podcast series. They've done 2 so far. One on June 12th and one on the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Both excellent historicals on Nigeria. And I think it ties into
we'll put that link on this podcast.
It ties. So people are doing it. We just need more and more and more of that. We just need the investments. We know that the state and our billionaires and millionaires are not minded towards supporting the arts and humanities. We have to find a way of getting them interested in funding the humanities. But that is the role of the intellectual, to break down complex things, including history. So it's not enough. But, what we teach and what we don't teach are actually 2 sides of the same coin. I did history in Bakori as my SSS, my GC, whatever, the school living certificate exam. And I was telling everybody that as far as I remember, history ended in 1960. Here we were learning, that's history of Nigeria or the formation of Nigeria. And I'm like, why didn't we learn about the Civil War? Why was I learning about the Civil War as an adult in the week? Do you understand? So even when we say history, we have to be careful, like whose history? Which calls upon Chimamanda's danger of a single story. Even history should be contested. You need many versions of history to get to a fuller picture. I won't even say the truth, to get to a fuller picture of what the history was.
So they're more like an investigative history than just somebody I think it's still about. Actually, having said that, I know you said social media is toxic. I actually recently, and I'll try and find it and put the link here, I started following a young lady who recreates history in a kind of AI version. So she put herself, in the former Benin, within that state. Yeah. And she's walking. It's quite vivid. And she does various recreations and she's there. And she's telling different. So I found myself, I watched several before I took myself off because it helped me visualize it in a way that I couldn't normally, whilst supplying you with information which can also go and verify. So I guess we shouldn't be too discouraged. And somehow the topics have come full circle, because whether it's your topic about, the public intellectual, or mine about the animosity or the way violence and hatred has seeped into all our discourse around nation building, it still feeds into itself, because there needs to be that rigor in the way we think through our solutions, in the way we work together to try and understand our problems. And that goes down to the public intellectual.
It does, absolutely. So there's again a streamlining of our two topics. Even though we pick them quite independently of each other, but they've sort of come together because, the toxic politics is also driven by, this Olodo uprising, where it's just, it's all about performing and being clownish and, just not taking things seriously. And I mean, one point that Chika made that I was sort of thinking on and still will continue thinking because I'm not sure. But I agree with him when he says, the very dark man and these different types of people. And I think you can find that even whether it's Joe Rogan in the US. Yeah, there's a different version of who a celebrity is and who people pay attention to and why they pay attention to them. But it still doesn't mean that there's no room for intellectuals. So it doesn't have to be one or. It can be very dark man and Odinkalo. You understand? It doesn't have to be one or the other. Each group has their use. Has their use in society. And who knows, maybe the very dark men are also, taking from what intellectuals are breaking down and, putting it into even more bite-sized. Yes, exactly. Language. So for me, it's still part of the ecosystem. It's not to say one voice is superior to the other, but we do have to question where the intellectuals are, because they tend to be the conscience of society.
I know, I agree with you, because that's why I was at pains to expand. Being an intellectual isn't just down to expertise. It's down to how the way you reason, the integrity behind your thoughts, the motives behind your thought processes, and what you're seeking to unveil. You're like, I'm trying to think of the word, the people in the laboratories who are carrying out research. Yeah. What is driving that research? You can carry out research with a bias, and all you're doing is just, it's a sham, really. You're just trying to put forward your propaganda behind using the research as a cover. But you can actually carry out research genuinely and maybe not have all the resources, and that will still point you to something much more useful. So I fundamentally think, it's about the sincerity, the integrity behind it. And when you mentioned Very Dark Man, when you mentioned the issue of how, all these accounts that have been discovered as atrocious as it is, I think it's one of those situations where it will take more than public intellectual to tackle such impunity. It'll take various, activists, various people on different levels to make it impossible for the government to push this one under the rug.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. And that's, again, it's almost like, did you read my article? You should read it. Maybe you should put it as a link. You should put the link. I'll share it because yes, that's also what I was just saying. You need to be consistent. It's not that and unfortunately Nigeria, which is another reason why we need the coalition and the company, because Nigeria or the world right now is literally a 6 times a day, something, there's just no end to the things that intellectuals should be raising and warning about and talking about. It's just so much. It's a full-time job. Again, when you're part of a group or a system or network or ecosystem, then the burden doesn't seem so heavy. At least it's shared with like travelers. Yeah. But I think we should bring it to a close unless you have any last words.
Yeah, no, I think I'm satisfied with this. And I think what my takeaway really on this is where you are in pursuit of the truth, which for me is really the arrowhead of your public intellectualism. Try and encourage other people in that pursuit, because I think people are keen. When I listen to the responses to some who come out and speak truth to power, it's almost like you're feeding a thirst. People are so keen to hear someone speak in an unbiased manner. It's almost like it feeds a hunger in them that tells them that all is not lost. So I think we should keep shining that light, keep speaking truth to power, no matter how lonely it is, because many people are there waiting for someone who just articulates what it is they already know deep down in their hearts.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you, listeners, fans, audience, for joining us on this conversation today on What's on Your Mind. Do continue to join us. Do check out the links that's going to be in the notes. And thank you, as always, to our very able professional producers, Anthony and Joel. Thank you for what you do, for making this easy for Ekene and I.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of What's on Your Mind. Join in every second and fourth Wednesday of the month. You can listen to What's on Your Mind here on Africa Tech Radio and on all popular audio streaming platforms. Please leave your thoughts about this episode in the comments and share this podcast with someone.